Okay. Tashdile, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our speakers and to our lovely live audience tuning in from across the world. Welcome to the virtual event of Freedom Hour, an online discussion hosted by Asia Freedom Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that calls for democracy and religious freedom in Tibet and China. I'm Sakina Bhatt, the moderator for Asia Freedom Institute's Freedom Hour. Today we will be discussing the rise of China's digital authoritarianism, its use of technology for surveillance, censorship, and control. Under Xi Jinping, China has become a digital totalitarian state and is exporting its model through initiatives like the Digital Silk Road. We will explore the key aspects of China's digital authoritarianism, democratic alternatives, and strategies for foreign governments and the international community to counter the threat posed by China's initiatives. And to have this discussion, we have with us Sarah Cook, the Senior Advisor for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan from Freedom House, Rafael Rohozinski, Principal and CEO of SecDev Group and 0 Point Security, Lobsang Gyatso Sitar, Director of Technology in Tibet Action Institute, and he is also the member of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile. I extend my very warm welcome to our esteemed panelists, and I, on behalf of Asia Freedom Institute, greatly appreciate your presence and look forward to a fruitful discussion. So let me quickly run through the agenda with you. Firstly, we will be starting off with the two general questions. And for that, all our speakers will have 3 minutes each. And that will be followed by 3 rounds of individual questions. And we will be starting off with Sarah Cook. And for that also, you will have 3 minutes each. So without further ado, let me start off with the first general question to Sarah. So Sarah, how do you see the expansion of China's digital authoritarianism, particularly under Xi Jinping's leadership? Can you tell us the key characteristics of the Chinese model of digital authoritarianism? How grave of a threat is it to democracy and internet freedom? Sarah.
Thank you, Sakina, and thank you for having me here. It's really great to join this discussion. I'm actually going to start at the end of your question to talk a little bit about what we mean by digital authoritarianism in the Chinese context, and then talk a little bit about the international dimensions of this, because the core start is really within China. And the Chinese Communist Party has really built up the most multi-layered and sophisticated system of internet and really social control in the world today. And that has multiple dimensions. There are dimensions that relate to content, how information on people in China are blocked from accessing or sharing certain kinds of information through the Great Firewall that we've all heard about, but also because social media platforms are required to censor their users, basically. And then you've got the surveillance and monitoring dimensions. And that's the area where, again, actually, there are a lot of private companies involved doing the bidding of the Chinese government and the Communist Party. And so you have these multiple layers of monitoring and tracking. Some that are more old-fashioned. There are still village committees and people walking around with red bands in many parts of China monitoring, quote, suspicious troublemakers that include dissidents or religious believers that the Communist Party doesn't like. But of course, there's increasingly the digital dimension to it. And that includes various forms of facial recognition surveillance, requirements for people to register with their real names when they use any kind of social media platform. And of course, then the social media platforms can send information back. So that's a little bit of a dip of what you have inside China. And what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years is that internet controls and digital authoritarianism in China under Xi, but even before, have really shrunk. So it's gotten kind of more sophisticated and more robust within China. And then you have the international dimensions. And I would say there's 2 aspects to that. One is the actual export of the model or export of certain technologies that the Communist Party and private companies engage in, particularly when it comes to surveillance. We've seen a little bit with some internet censorship filtering technologies, but that's a little bit harder to mimic. The other is various trainings for officials from other countries on how to do like news management and other kinds of euphemisms. And then the last element I talk about, I would say, and I know I'm getting on time, is transnational action that the Chinese Communist Party is taking outside of China against the targets and, quote, domestic enemies that it views. And that can take various forms in terms of digital surveillance, physical attacks, all kinds of various media influence, and so forth. And so I think that's where you see that Uyghurs or Tibetans or Hong Kongers or Falun Gong practitioners or Chinese dissidents, even outside of China, are subject to various forms of digital authoritarianism from the Chinese Communist Party. So you've got kind of the core of the digital authoritarianism inside China, the transnational dimensions that target particular communities, and then the export, which is basically other governments and officials with authoritarian leanings or other political interests, trying to basically borrow, or in some cases buy, parts of the Chinese Communist Party's digital authoritarianism package and implement it themselves in their own countries. And I would say under Xi Jinping, all of that has expanded. So I'll stop there, and hope that gives kind of a first initial picture of what we're talking about here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Rafael, let's hear your perspective.
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that Sarah said. I think the way that we need to understand digital authoritarianism is that there's the digital part and there's the authoritarian part, and that the authoritarian part is very much rooted in China's system of rule, and in particular, the rule of the Communist Party and under Xi Jinping, a return to a kind of an orthodoxy. But perhaps what sets it apart and makes it a little bit different from other forms of digital authoritarianism or authoritarian states that have been starting to use digital technologies is how rapid and comprehensive it has been, and how rapidly and comprehensively how it's evolved and unrolled, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years with COVID accelerating, in a sense, physical controls over the Chinese population at a pace that probably wouldn't have been possible had COVID not happened. But I'd like to sort of maybe point out 3 distinctive features of Chinese digital authoritarianism, which is worthwhile for us to consider, because it then helps answer the question whether this model is actually exportable, sustainable, and scalable. The first is that the fact that when we talk about digital authoritarianism, there are 3 dimensions to it. The first is the cyber dimension. And here I think it's worthwhile pointing out that what we essentially have is a kind of app authoritarianism, where the Chinese government recognized that by centralizing control over those kinds of applications that citizens would require in order to do everything from gaining education, employment, and moving forward, and essentially putting it into what in North America we have separated across several apps, they can created essentially one central data pool from which an individual can be identified across the billion other individuals that live in China. And here we're really talking about WeChat and the whole suite of applications built around that, which for those of you who don't have familiarity with it, is more than a chat application. It's also how you do your banking. It's also how you do your reservations. It's how you reserve your travel. It's how essentially all aspects of you as a human being are quantified and monitored. And that includes, that creates all sorts of dimensions of control, which I think are important to recognize, because it's not just simply state surveillance of you as an individual. It's your own awareness of how you're perceived by the state. And this links to the second level of control, which is the social credit system, where that quantification of you is actually then used in order to allow you the privilege of certain things or not in return for a degree of loyalty, demonstrable loyalty, or at least a degree of non-transgression. And then the third layer, which I think is really equally important, is the physical layer. And this is the investment that the Chinese government has made into smart city systems. At the end of the day, cities are where people live, where their lives economically, socially are held. And the ability to not only track people through cyberspace, through this app economy, but also through physical space, adds a kind of a comprehensiveness to it that is really difficult to see elsewhere. With the emergence of AI, and I know that we're going to talk about it later, that ability to aggregate data at the individual level, I think creates a lot of chilling effects on individuals that really define the Chinese model of digital authoritarianism. And I'll just say 2 more things quickly, even though I know I'm over my 3 minutes. There's 3 questions we need to answer. First of all, is this Chinese model of digital authoritarianism possible to emulate? And again, there's a characteristic here of both Chinese governance as well as the way that it's been implemented, that may simply not be applicable in other places that don't share the same kind of characteristics. Secondly, it's difficult. Is it possible to scale? In other words, is this something that can be expanded on, or have we reached the kind of apogee of what's possible? And here it's important to talk about the complicity of Western companies in building this architecture. And thirdly, is it possible to sustain? And this is both in terms of the social consequences of this level of control over a population, as well as recognizing the fact that much of the technology that is being employed in building it does have roots in Western technologies and models, and whether the Chinese themselves, in the absence of now this entrepreneurial spirit that I think Xi Jinping's government has really started to tamp down on, whether or not sustaining this model into the future and growing it is really going to be possible. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Raphael. Lufsangla, let's hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, Sakina. So first of all, I just want to thank you and the AFI team for having me here. And I think, yes, and Sarah and Raphael have mentioned a bit on the digital authoritarianism, and I do agree with a lot of that, and I don't really want to reiterate that. So I think for me, when I was thinking about the digital authoritarianism, and I was just thinking about the consequences for it a bit, so in a sense, like what was some of the reasons, and like looking at maybe thinking about like the whole syncretization of where it actually is taking Tibetans, like Uyghurs, Mongolians, and like all the different communities that are part of like what we call China in some ways, right? And thinking about like how that model, like whether it's like the tool and the technology that's being used to create a uniformity. And I was just reading something this morning. It was like where the Pride Parade, which used to happen in China for a very long time, for a few years, is now completely gone. And the fact that it wasn't even about different groups of communities, but it was also about like conformity to a kind of like the old Mao kind of thinking of like how a Chinese should be, whether it's a masculinity and all of that, and how a lot of the stuff that like Raphael and Sarah mentioned about like the tools and the technology, the social credit system, and all of that are being used to kind of create an ideal Xi Jinping's kind of vision of what a Chinese should be, and how whether that is actually sustainable or not. I think that's also a very big question of like, how far can you take that? And I think that is something that we might see in the next few years of like, is there something that is actually implementable on such a large scale, or is it a fool's errand to actually do something like that? Thanks.
Thank you, Lufsangla. And thank you, everyone, for giving a comprehensive insight about China's digital authoritarianism. And now my second general question is, how can the multinational tech companies, foreign governments, multilateral institutions, and the international communities work together to address the threat of China's digital authoritarianism? Since you are experts from your own areas, can you also tell us what strategies can be implemented to counter the dangers of China's AI-driven repression and authoritarianism, as well as similar models adopted by other regimes? Sarah.
Sure. So again, I would divide this between the situation inside China and outside of China. I think inside China is a much harder nut to crack. I think one thing that I think there's more clarity on now than there used to be, is that this is a deliberate strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you're looking for some kind of tactic or effort that would really require the Chinese government adherence, that's going to be a much heavier lift. And they're very good, as we've seen, at making agreements, including signing international treaties, and then basically doing what they want. So I think the strategies that kind of go around them, whether it's supporting circumvention tool technologies that allow still millions, tens of millions of people in China every month, and Rafal probably can speak more to this, to access uncensored information. And we have a project, the China Media Bulletin, that reaches tens of thousands of people inside China, working thanks to some of these tools each month. with information about how surveillance is evolving, how censorship is evolving. So there's clearly an interest for people inside China. And there are still ways, as technologically sophisticated as it is, and despite the legal hurdles, for people to still access uncensored information. So I think maintaining, and to the extent that's scalable and expandable, that would be very important. I think then there's all of the elements of international pressure and advocacy for the individuals that end up getting sentenced for engaging in certain types of behaviors. And that was, I guess, one element of the kind of the straddling of the physical and the cyber that Rafal had mentioned, which is very real in China, where people are sentenced to prison, long prison terms, and face horrific abuses because of what they did in cyberspace. And so I think all of those kinds of elements related to also sanctioning officials that are responsible, policy responses that honestly we've seen a lot more of, that groups like Freedom House have been recommending for many years. But I think really it's only been over the last 5 or 6 years that we're seeing Western or foreign governments really take that kind of action. So I think part of it is to really be strategic and see how you can maximize this and find those loopholes. Because it really is life or death matters for people in China. It's not just about, I mean, some of it is cultural and so forth, but it's about whether someone's detained. It's whether they can know information about diseases like COVID. These are very real issues for people in China, and the more that can be done would be better. I think the other is the outside of China, and that's honestly where foreign governments have the upper hand, but we've been asleep at the wheel. Again, I think that's starting to change, but I think even there outside of China, there's really two dimensions. One is democracies themselves, and what are some of the safeguards that need or can be put in place to protect vulnerable minorities that are targeted for transnational repression, to make sure that our own companies are not exporting technologies that feed and serve digital authoritarianism or even aid it in internationally, and to push back at a diplomatic level against some of the things, the machinations at entities like the ITU and the like. I think then, and honestly, from the research that Freedom House has done in our Beijing's Global Media Influence Project, there's more and more pushback, not just within what we would think of as Western democracies. Civil society groups, investigative reporters, some governments in a wide range of countries throughout Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, a little bit less, are awakening and are being much more vocal and outspoken and trying to take measures to shore up resilience to these types of encroachments from the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it's a very different landscape, actually, that we're facing, again, globally compared to 10 years ago when I started looking at this, when no one was really talking about it and people were much less skeptical of what the CCP was doing. And again, I think there's been an awakening, but there's a lot more to do to shore up the resilience of these transnational, international dimensions of the digital authoritarianism.
Thank you, Sarah. Rafal, what about you? Over to you.
So this is going to be very recurrent, I think. What she said, I very much agree with what Sarah's saying, but maybe let me put it in a bit of a different frame. To some extent, I'm very skeptical that what we're facing is the tide of authoritarianism that's being bolstered by digital means that somehow is putting democracies on the back foot. I think that's true to a certain extent, but I think that probably has less to do with the kind of appeal of the Chinese or the Russian model than it does for the fact that globalization has had huge negative consequences for large populations in the South, which means that there is, I think, a deficit in terms of understanding or a deficit in trust of what the liberal democratic market system can bring, because we've seen a lot of friction that has caused populations to become impoverished, lose their rights, and feel like they're being exploited in different kinds of ways. But to equate that with, the appeal of the Chinese model, I think is a little bit misguided. And I think that, like Sarah says, I think there's a lot of resilience that can be built on without necessarily having to focus just on the Chinese threat. I think, frankly, Xi Jinping, in his last 4 years, is effectively going down the same path of the great historical mistake that was taken by the Soviet Union. It's always been a question: did the Soviet Union collapse as a result of freedom from without, in other words, from pressure from the without, or from freedom from within? And at the end of the day, the more that you start to constrain your population, control your population, the more you actually undermine the very principle of rule on which all governments, whether they're communist or secular or religious, ultimately depend. So you have to ask yourself the question, as China isolates and it becomes more isolated, recognizing that it's still a very large autarkic population, what happens to China when it loses access to foreign technology that ultimately, end of the day, let it have this giant leap forward in terms of its leadership and its ability to build this digital layer on top of authoritarianism? What happens internally in China when it starts to lose the ability to innovate? Because at the end of the day, individual freedoms are what stimulate individuals to innovate, to have a reason to innovate. Right now, China leads in about 44 out of 47 critical technology areas. It's only second, it competes with the US basically in these areas. But that assumes the same level of interaction, of entanglement, as some people have said, between Western and Chinese companies. When that happens, when that leaves, what happens to this model? Can it sustain itself? And I think it's important to recognize, that China is not just China, big letter, bold letters. It's a China with an aging population, where that large workforce that moved out of the villages and into the eastern coast or the eastern coastal cities is aging, and is, sadly, going to become less competitive. Right now, China may be competing in terms of GDP with the US, but it's competing in terms of its population base with India, which is going to overtake China in terms of population in the next 4 or 5 years, with a much younger population, with a much more entrepreneurial population, with much more incentive for innovation. So I think, when we think about this, there are things that we can do from the outside. And certainly I think disentanglement on the economic side undermines China's ability to continue to benefit from entanglement as a means of building its model. I think internally, greater political control means to a certain extent much less innovation, which means that their ability to sustain or make this model attractive to others will become less. And I'll end with one other point. It's true that Chinese technology, particularly physical surveillance technology, is something that has been exported and is being used around the world. But rather than reinforcing digital authoritarianism at the state level, what it's doing is it's leading to a privatization of surveillance, a surveillance economy, which in some ways may be the greater danger than just the digital authoritarian model that we're talking about today. Thanks.
Thank you, Rafael. Lupsangla, let's hear your perspective on this.
Yes. So I think, as Sarah and Rafael mentioned a bit about in terms of like how do you hold China accountable in certain cases. So I think from a Tibetan perspective, I think there's been a lot of like advocacy efforts. So for example, like just to give you a recent example, is like the DNA collection of Tibetans, and the fact that like Thermo Fisher is responsible for like giving for providing a lot of the tools and technologies. So the fact that we are trying to hold them accountable is something that I think needs to continue. However, there is a challenge of like, well, if one company, how many other companies are also going to be doing similar work? And a question that I think I have personally is like, when will be a time where you wouldn't really need a lot of the Western companies to actually do a lot of that? Like when you actually have a lot of Chinese companies being able to do a lot of that, because there's been so much export of technology to Chinese companies, whether it's like, I mean, like one example that I was thinking about was like I think about a few months ago or a year back, the Apple leak, where it wasn't just about like the hardware, the made in China in terms of Apple devices. It was about a lot of the technology that was being transported there. So the thing is like, it used to be like when we're talking about manufacturing, right, in China, right? But a lot of the technology is being transported, and a lot of skills are being shared with Chinese technologists. So that actually creates a lot of skill in the Chinese economy, or whether it's the Chinese community, right? And what that actually entails in terms of the long run, whether the reliance on Western technologies is going to be as important as it is right now, and how much kind of way would we have forward in terms of being able to hold those accountable. And I think another thing about that, in terms of like looking at how do you kind of reduce the impact of some of the digital authoritarianism, whether it's inside or outside, is like, is it a multilateral approach, right? And I think that is something that is lacking in the government sense, right? For example, like the US has the Uyghur, like, so for example, if you look at like Thermo Fisher, and it wasn't allowed to work in East Turkestan because there was a US barring of like technologies relating to DNA and all of that for police in East Turkestan, but it wasn't all over Tibet or China. So that allowed some space. And at the same time, it also like other countries are also like, are they part of the same policy? So I think that whole aspect of when we talk about like the democratic countries around the world, and when it comes to the whole like economics connections between China and the rest of the world and a lot of the Western countries, I think unless the approach is multilateral, right, as I think most of us know, however, is the multilateral approach something that countries are willing to go? And I think the question is like, who's going to be leading that, right? For example, for a very long time, the US was leading it, but with the US political crisis coming up in the last couple of years, there has been a lack of leadership in terms of some of the multilateral engagements. And so I think there is a question in terms of like, if you do want to hold China accountable for a lot of the aspects of like whether it's like the digital authoritarianism and like the transport or like even like the movement of a lot of those tools for a lot of different countries, how do you hold that accountable, right? And I think there is a question, because if it's just one country or if it's just one company, they tend to get like sidetracked, side blocked, or they tend to get into a lot of issues. So the question is, where is that space? And I think that's I think I always have a bit of question about like, how do you move forward? And I think there have been a number of cases where a lot of like Western companies, or whether it's like Western education groups, like whether it's like the contract that was signed between MIT and iFlyTech on AI. So a lot of those things tend to be more about like, oh, this is more about technology, this is more about research. And there lies the question of like, where when we talk about due diligence, right, we always talk about like, what is the harm? But a lot of times you always talk about like, this is the technology that we're working on, we're not talking about this. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the actual impacts and like the research aspect of it. So I think there has to be more connection between those two to actually make sure that we can hold these institutions or companies more accountable, I think, in some ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Lupsangla, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing us your expertise and your insights with us. And now moving on to the individual questions. So Sarah, for the 8th consecutive year, China has been ranked as the worst abuser of internet freedom by Freedom House in Freedom on the Net. Can you explain how Freedom House accesses internet freedom and the situation in China regarding government censorship and the control of the digital sphere? Over to you, Sarah.
Sure. So Freedom on the Net is a project that's been running now for more than 10 years. It started actually 15. It started almost 15, started in 2009. And basically what it looks at is our conditions for internet freedom. And now it's up to 70 countries. And there are 3 main dimensions to it. One is the access to the technology and ability to get online. How fast are the internet speeds? What kind of controls are there over the market for internet service providers and things like that? The regulatory environment. So that's the first one. And that area, actually, China does okay because clearly there's internet connectivity, especially in urban areas. Sometimes the speed is slowed because of content restrictions like the Great Firewall. But that's the category of the 3 that we look at that China does the best. The second is content controls. So how is it that a government, or in some cases non-governmental entities, play a role in controlling what content and information people access? And I'll get back to that with regards to China. And the third is violations of user rights. So what are the protections? What are the legal protections on the one hand, and how robust are they? On the other, what are some of the criminal penalties people may face? Are there people in jail? What is the surveillance situation like? Are there attacks? Are there cyber attacks and things like that? So when we look at the situation in China, on that last, on access, China does okay. On content, China only gets like 2 out of 35 points. So China's score overall is only 10 out of 100. So if you were a student in school and you got a grade like that, your parents probably wouldn't be very happy about it. And that's a real decline. When we started scoring China was like at a 17. So you can see a place that was already doing pretty poorly and how much the even existing space from before has shrunk over the last 10 to 15 years. But so with content, I think what really stands out with regards to China is what Rafal was talking about, and that's kind of the authoritarianism. It's not just the Great Firewall that blocks people from accessing websites outside of China. Yes, that blocks people from, say, finding information from Freedom House or from the New York Times, and that's important. But since 2009 already, it's been used to block many of the social media applications that people around the world use, Facebook, YouTube, and so forth. And you have domestic alternatives in China that have been cultivated, WeChat being the most recent and the one, as Rafal said, that's used in so many different aspects of life. But you have Weibo, which is kind of like Twitter. You have video sharing apps that are kind of like YouTube's, and all kinds of other. And that's one reason why it's such an innovative and robust and has its own internal competition. But essentially, the Chinese government is able to force these companies to censor their users, to monitor, to remove content, to do some of the moderation we see globally on content that is, like that is violent or child pornography or things like that. But that gets much more into the realm of political or religious speech and so forth. And that's really one of those aspects, honestly, that seems much harder for other countries to replicate in terms of one of the questions that Rafal raised earlier. I think the 2 points actually that China gets on this are because we have some questions that relate to civil society and the extent to which users are able to still try to access information or courageously share information. And so those are the 2 points that China gets. It's because of actually the societal pushback, not necessarily the government's policies. And on violations of user rights, China gets no point. So this is a country that has the most robust system for criminalizing speech, for reducing anonymity, for jailing people for very long prison terms, including over 10 years, sometimes even life imprisonment, for what we would be even by Chinese, minor, in fact, a few tweets about, a mockery of Xi Jinping, even air pollution. Like, it's not even all just political. It can just be about health or public safety or things like that, that people get sentenced to. And so I think that's where you also, again, see the trend, the differentiation between China and even some other authoritarian regimes, not only in the severity of the punishments, but also the scale, because it's a country that has tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, arguably even millions of political and religious prisoners, many of them actually detained also for freedom of expression violations, including for digital ones. So I think that's how Freedom on the Net tries to look at internet freedom, and that's how China is assessed. And the project itself, uses a lot of the information that other groups have collected in documentation, along with looking at Chinese government laws, information, and other original research. So I hope that gives a good snapshot of where China sits and really what is unique and so robust and comprehensive about this system of control.
Thank you, Sarah, for so elaborately explaining to us about how Freedom House accesses the internet freedom and the situation in China. And I really liked the part where you said that, they only have like 10 out of 100, and that would be really, that is a really, a bad mark for even a student to get. Yeah. So, okay, now moving on to, So now moving on to Rafal, given your expertise in information security and cyber warfare and your significant contribution in uncovering the state-sponsored cyber espionage networks such as the GhostNet, could you talk about some of the cyber espionage activities China has been involved in and how these activities fit into China's bigger plan to control information and the internet, and what lessons can we learn from these cyber attacks?
Yeah,
over to you, Rafa.
Yeah, great question, and I can talk for more than 3 minutes on this. But again, I think let's put this into perspective. In 2014, only 7% of low and medium income countries were pursuing digital transformation. By 2022, it's 70%. The cognizance, the recognition of the importance of cyberspace as a strategic domain, both domestically as well as foreign competition, is something which is widespread, and it's not necessarily just restricted to China, Russia, and authoritarian states. It's much more widespread. But again, I think in the case of China, what's been unique about the way that they've exploited this domain has been the size, the persistence, and the impact of the activities they've pursued, and the fact that they got into this very, very early, relatively speaking. So, there's sort of been three phases, if you like, of Chinese cyber activities. in cyberspace, which is worthwhile to recognize. The first, which happened between approximately 2008 and 2016, was really the focus on massive intellectual property theft, where the vast majority of cyber espionage that was carried out under the stewardship of the Chinese state was aimed at acquiring trade secrets that allowed them to essentially build industries, such as in artificial intelligence and defense and elsewhere, with a big kickstart. And that I think is what really woke up most policymakers in the U.S. and elsewhere, because they recognized that this transgressed a number of norms. Forget about the norms of whether or not you should be messing in other people's computer systems, but the fact that this was done with intent as a component of Chinese industrial strategy at a time when China was trying to join the WTO and these kinds of mechanisms. I think that's what was the big wake-up moment. Then sort of 2015, 2017, it's clear that this espionage now turned or started to focus more on very, very specific strategic issues. So this is when we had the theft, for example, of personnel data from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, which basically were the classified biographies of people working within the U.S. government across all areas. So that raised alarm bells as well, because it really gave a sense that this espionage was no longer just for economic reasons, but it was also as a means of bolstering competition between states. And I think what we've seen in the last 2 years, which has been particularly worrying, has been the fact that Chinese intelligence services now not only enter networks, but they now pre-position malware, particularly within critical infrastructure, U.S. critical infrastructure, which, if you look in strategic terms, starts to become signaling to say, if you do something that transgresses our state policy, we can retaliate in ways such as disabling infrastructure. So it's gone from economic gathering now to an element of state policy, which crosses that threshold between purely cyber and cyber physical events. In other words, events that can create loss of life and damage of property. What's motivated China to get into this? Well, I think, frankly, we have to also recognize that prior to 1995, the internet was owned by the U.S., largely speaking, still is in terms of routing. And that, if you're a government official waking up in Beijing and the first thing that greets you on your screen is a Microsoft, logo saying welcome to Windows, that gives you a sense of insecurity. So competition, I think, is something that has really driven China's desire in cyberspace and pursuing it as a specific strategic intent. It's part of great power competition. And I think what has changed, perhaps in the last 4 years, and especially since the last Party Congress, is that China is no longer simply being passive, but it's now being much more assertive. And it's happening in cyber, but it's also happening in space. It's also happening in nuclear, and it's also happening in the area of artificial intelligence. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raphael. It was a really interesting one. Moving on to Lupsangla. Lupsangla, how has China's digital authoritarianism impacted the lives of the Tibetans living both outside and inside of Tibet? And what is your perspective on the risk faced by the Tibetans and specific communities like the Uyghurs, the Mongolians, and the Hong Kongers?
Sure. Thank you, Sakina. So I think it's when I was thinking about as I think about the question, right, in terms of like how it has impacted. I mean, like there's been, if you think about, like, as I think Sarah mentioned earlier about like the real name registration requirement for a lot of these applications, and like the fact that anytime you're on a tool, whether you're on an app or a tool that is like in China, you have to have your real name and how that is associated with you. As Raphael mentioned earlier about the social credit system in terms of the social impacts of what you might say online. I think, and at the same time, I think I was also thinking about, like, I think there was a report by Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy around 2020, where there was a surveillance report, and it was focusing on a number of the traditional systems, right? Whether it's the grid management system, where like Tibet is counties are being separated into grid, or the double-linked household, where different households are supposed to spy on each other, and along with that, a lot of the other digital like means, whether it's like the CCTVs in a lot of different spaces, or whether something like, if you look at like the 2017 cybersecurity law and how it was implemented in the Tibetan context, where, like, for example, if you're part of a WeChat group, an owner or an admin is liable for what is being said in a group, which is kind of trying to use the intermediary liability, which is in a very different context, right? So I think a lot of those aspects of digital authoritarianism, along with the traditional structures, I think has led to a lot of control in terms, and also a lot of like self-censorship and the impact. I think when I was thinking about the impact, the first thing that I always remember is like the self-immolation of Tsao Nubula, who was a Tibetan singer, a 25-year-old Tibetan singer, famous all over Tibet, all over China as well. And when he self-immolated in, I think, February 25th, 2022, it took almost more than a week or 10 days to even identify that it was him. And that happened in Lhasa, in front of the Potala Palace, so in a very public place. And even till now, we don't even have a photo or any information about that. So in terms of information, I'm saying like no evidence of what happened. So the thing is like that actually kind of talks about the impact of what's happening inside Tibet, and the fact that there's so much repression and so much control that we used to get like certain images and stuff like that, but something that happened in such a public place. And like I think a friend of mine or a colleague of mine, you talked about like if something happened in Times Square with thousands of, I'm not like Times Square, like I don't think Potala is as busy as Times Square, but like with thousands of people around with their cell phones, with their like devices, right? There would have been some evidence of it, but the impact of it being able to like the control that the Chinese government has, that nothing actually came out, I think speaks to how much the whole traditional structures of control, along with the digital authoritarianism and the digital tools, has impacted how people communicate, how people share information. And I think that speaks to the challenge of like of what it actually means as a Tibetan, whether it's a Tibetan or a Uyghur or a Mongolian or a Hong Konger living inside right now, living in Tibet, or whether it's East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia, or living in Hong Kong. It speaks to their mindset and how much repression there is. So I think that's part of, I think, the impact inside. And if you look at the impact outside, I think an important part about that is, I think Sarah spoke about it a bit briefly earlier, was the transnational repression. And because a lot of Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Mongolians have a lot of family inside, Hong Kongers. And the fact that Tibetans have faced transnational repression for almost like more than like, I can't even recall, more than 50 years. There was always this case of it, but the heightened like level of transnational repression, I have seen contacts of mine or friends of mine who would actually, like, not to name names, but who would actually be on media and who would be talking about certain things about what is happening inside Tibet, now don't even like give any information out. And so it's not about that they didn't face issues earlier, it's about the level of repression, the level of control that they have, not only inside and outside, that restricts a lot of that issues. And the fact of the matter is, I think as we all are looking at transnational repression, I think there is a need to figure out how do you hold that accountable. And I think a lot of different governments are looking at it, and which I think is a really important first step. And I think trying to figure out, like, for example, Safeguard Defenders had a recent report on looking at like Chinese police stations and all of that, and kind of figuring out how do you hold certain entities liable for what is happening with, if you think about it, American citizens, European citizens being repressed in countries which are not China. So I think that is a question, that how do you hold the Chinese government accountable for what they're doing, especially outside of China, right? And how do you make sure that these individuals are able to express without fear of repercussions? Thanks.
Thank you, Lobsang La. And it's true that digital authoritarianism and transnational repression is an important consideration. And your insights today have underscored the urgent need for advocacy and support to protect the rights of the Tibetans, Uyghurs, and the rest of the ethnic communities. Thank you, Lobsang La. And Moving on to Sarah. Sarah, in the light of Xi Jinping's strong focus on national security and the stability of the Chinese Communist Party, he has emphasized the need for a new pattern of development with a new security architecture in China. How has this increased emphasis on security impacted the lives of individuals who are already living under the worst environment of internet freedom, and also for the people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, and East Turkestan? What additional directives and changes do you think the Chinese authorities will implement in their existing cybersecurity law, which is already known for its strict and harsh measures?
Well, I think
Sarah, over to you.
that's a very important question. I mean, I think for some context, I mean, one, the cybersecurity law is really just one part of a huge apparatus of rules, regulations, and informal directives that are issued regularly either by state entities or by Communist Party entities to individuals in China, including and to companies, that really are what keep this apparatus of control not only running, but honestly, the CCP is constantly trying to refine the control apparatus. And that is in terms of both some of the physical dimensions that we've heard about today, as well as some of the rules and regulations, as well as some of the technology. And so I thought I would share maybe 3 very recent examples of things that we've come across that I would say are, innovations or kind of the next stages of responses that we're seeing. One, so for example, the Cyber Administration of China, that's the kind of the main regulator. And it's very active. You go to it, it's constantly announcing new cleanup campaigns that are forcing private companies to enhance their censorship. It's issuing fines, expanding rules. So honestly, just this month, one set of rules that were announced would regulate and tighten control over features like AirDrop on Apple's AirDrop that allows users kind of basically through Bluetooth technology to share information from one device to another that's in a close proximity. And that's something that already Apple's been forced to put some restrictions on within China. But these regulations would go further, would involve real name registration, would limit aspects of this technology, not only for Apple, but for a wide range of companies. And essentially was triggered in part because during the protests against the COVID controls that we saw in late 2022, this was apparently one way that people shared information when they were in close proximity. Though I've heard about it from other types of activists who have used it to share uncensored information. So that's something that we've seen over and over again, where there's some new technology, there's some window, it's slightly unregulated, activists kind of innovate and jump in, and then the CCP regulatory regime tries to close that loophole. So that's just one example. Another, in terms of the surveillance side of things, is that Chinese police are spending across the country billions of dollars to purchase equipment and that allows for various forms of enhancing not just the surveillance, but the data integration dimension. So there was a report that was published in May by China Digital Times. It's a group in California. And they found that from September 2005 to January 2022, local police across 30 provinces, so throughout China, had signed over 800 contracts worth almost $1 billion just for one aspect of the surveillance system, a geographic information system, which basically stores, analyzes data related to the geospatial kind of situation. It's used in a lot of places for kind of disease or environmental damage monitoring. But for police, they basically use it, and they're very explicit. This is all based on Chinese government and company documents, on using it to visualize protests or things like that, or just an activist handing out flyers. On top of that, you add other reports that we've heard from and investigations that have found that Chinese tech companies are themselves constantly innovating to be able to have better products for Chinese police of new alarms. So, for example, IPVM, which does a lot of research on surveillance, found various firms like Hikvision or Dahua. They've created a Uyghur alarm. And this, again, isn't only in Xinjiang. It's actually for Uyghurs throughout China because police are suspicious of Uyghurs even when they're in other parts of China. There was also one related to Falun Gong practitioners that are persecuted in China, but also very active in kind of grassroots information sharing, both related to what they're suffering, but also other topics. And then a more recent one, innovation, is a banner alarm. So one of the things that we see is that you see activists unfurling banners. There was this very prominent case in October last year on a bridge in Beijing. So now this is basically using facial recognition technology, AI surveillance, to be able to flag for police. Oh, there's just been a banner raised in this location, and then the police can go and catch that person. Those are things that were actually, without this technology, it's hard for Chinese police to be everywhere all the time at the same time. And so I think that's part of this constant building of this comprehensive system. And one last thing I would say is that what we see over and over again is also this learning curve within the Communist Party, where certain technologies or even individual officials that learn how to suppress and monitor a particular targeted community get promoted, so they're getting rewarded, but they get moved to other parts of China. And so actually a lot of the officials that were involved in in implementing the intensification of repression against Uyghurs had previously been in Tibet and implemented the grid system, had even earlier in their career suppressed Falun Gong. The person now in charge in Hong Kong on behalf of Beijing had been involved in suppressing Christians in Zhejiang, 7-8 years ago. So I think there's that circulation and this very, I would say, insidious expertise that Chinese officials gain, that they get promoted, and there's those internal incentives. And so I think that's also one of the really worrisome elements because of, and what aids the Communist Party in trying to close these loopholes constantly.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for explaining us about the strict policies that are there in China, and you giving us an example of how the activists raising banner are also, recognized by the Chinese authorities, shows us how harsh the digital authoritarianism and how effective it has been working in China. Thank you so much, Sarah. And moving on to Rafael. So, Rafael, how are AI and emerging technologies reshaping the field of cyber warfare? And how is China using these tools to strengthen its digital authoritarianism? For instance, in 2018, Zimbabwe government had signed an agreement with Chinese AI startup CloudWalk to create a national facial recognition database. Can you explain what this collaboration means and how AI is advancing surveillance technologies?
You ask the easiest questions to answer in 3 minutes. Let me be categorical, first of all. There's a real danger in AI, and that's because we're in an exceptionally exponential growth curve. And I think something that Sarah said is really true. Because AI is sexy, you have a lot of Chinese companies that are trying to innovate in order to position themselves well with the market that they have, which happens to be the market for the Chinese state for the large part. And a great example of this has been the merging of smart glass technology, eyeglasses, that now incorporate facial recognition and are used by Chinese police as a means of being able to identify people that they interact with. In Western countries, this would be seen as a massive transgression of privacy rights, but this is growing in the wild, and it's definitely aided by AI. But let me also take a bit of a skeptical look on it. So, we were one of the groups that had access to the very large database of surveillance technologies and surveillance results that was obtained through the Alibaba cloud and that belonged to the PSB in China. So this is all the material that was gathered through the various networks of smart city systems. And here's the takeaway. A lot of it is really lousy. In other words, even though the technology is built, it's built as if somebody had an order to build a specification, but that specification was never meant to be used. So no matter how advanced it may seem, if only 20% of it is working, that might be a problem. And that might not just be a problem of technology, but may speak a little bit more to systemic issues within China itself in terms of how these technologies can be operated. The other thing to recognize is that the really big exponential curve in AI right now is in what we call GPT, right? So generative, pre-trained, transformers. So of those, the T is the most important part, because generative pre-trained data is basically what facial recognition systems work on. In other words, they can look at a pattern at scale and be able to identify it 9 times out of 10. The transformer is basically the neural network cascade that can give context and can give meaning to whatever is being looked at. So what makes GPT seem like magic is that it can understand from what you give it as a prompt, context and meaning, and somehow fill in the blanks. But what we call AI hallucination actually isn't hallucination. It's that the transformer is creating synthetic data. It's making an extrapolation between a point that it knows and a point it doesn't know, and trying to fill in a reasonable way of being able to do it. Now, if you are an authoritarian state, and there are certain things that you definitely don't want talked about or definitely don't want seen, then you actually have to train your transformer not to see them. And that creates huge constraints over the real power that these things have. So ironically, AI is both an enabler of digital authoritarianism, but actually maybe its worst nightmare in terms of what it enables, unless it's constrained in ways that actually makes it less usable. Now, I think the important thing here, though, to recognize is the impact of AI and the way that it's being experimented in China on external markets. The reality is, and I've said this before, that the combination of cheap technologies such as CCTV systems and other sensors with rudimentary technologies like facial recognition, as is the case in Zimbabwe, has really democratized access to these surveillance technologies. Moreover, it's setting a norm, that these technologies can be used in these ways, which are sort of fundamentally at odds with, for example, rights that may be embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or privacy principles that are quite at the core of democratic systems. So we need to recognize, that risk is a risk to all societies, because it really undermines that fundamental confidence in institutions, which is based upon an individual feeling comfortable to express their opinion. So it's less about, I think, whether or not this will be sustained inside of China, and more about what kind of impact it has about the normalization of access to surveillance technologies, where when combined with even primitive forms of AI, could have quite a detrimental effect on rights.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for your insightful information, and also about letting us know about GPT. I'm going to dig more information into that later. And okay, moving on to Lobsangla. So Lobsangla, this is an interesting one. China has been selling surveillance technologies worldwide, including to countries known for suppressing freedom of speech and disregarding personal data privacy. We see countries like the United States banning Huawei equipment because of spying, and India has also been banning numerous Chinese apps due to security reasons. But the consumption of Chinese technology, especially the smartphones, remains high in India and amongst the Tibetan community. Could you discuss the potential security risk associated with the continued use of Chinese technology? How much awareness do the Tibetans in particular have on digital literacy in terms of using Chinese products and software, and what strategies can be implemented to enhance the understanding and deal with these risks better?
Sure, Sakina.
Lobsangla.
Thanks. So when I think about like a lot of the Chinese, whether it's like the smartphones or some of the CCTVs, like whether it's like Hikvision and others that are in like the global South market, or whether it's in like more developed nations, there is, I think I think the question was whether like Tibetans have an understanding. I think they have. However, there's also the question of like accessibility, right? Whether what is accessible, what is affordable. And I think that is something that also needs to be understood in terms of, well, can you afford an iPhone? For a lot of people, it might be beyond the budget. So what is affordable tends to be more Chinese-made phones, whether it's in the Indian market, and I think especially in a lot of the developing countries. And I'm not even just talking about India. I'm just, if you look at like a lot of African countries, if you look at a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, there's a lot of Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, and a lot of different phones which tend to be more affordable on the spectrum of what the middle class, or what is affordable for a lot of people. So at the same time, I think whether if you look at the Huawei ban in the US and others, if you look at like the app ban in India, and certain like discussions that it was being had in the US around TikTok banning and all of that, I think there has to be a bit more nuance and a comprehensive policy towards certain issues like that, rather than, because I think what is happening right now is it is becoming very more like, if it's Chinese, if it's bad. I think there has to be a bit better understanding of like how some of these tools are being used, and how, if there's like privacy concerns, if data is being transferred, I think there needs to be more research into that, and kind of like what kind of data is being transferred, what kind of privacy laws in different countries, whether it's like the GDPR in Europe and like privacy laws in the US, what is being uh, hindered. And I think those allow more stakeholders to be part of it, because right now it does tend to go into a very more like, okay, it's a Chinese app, so it should be banned because there's something nefarious about it. And I'm not saying that there's not something nefarious about it. There probably will be, especially with a lot of the Chinese laws, whether it's like the cybersecurity laws and a lot of those. I think the data, I forgot the national security law in terms of making Chinese companies and individuals liable to actually spy on behalf of the Chinese government, right? And there are certain laws which state certain aspects of that. So there is a question of like what is needed, and I think there needs to be a better strategy in terms of figuring out what is required. And I'm not saying that things shouldn't be banned, and they should be restricted in certain cases. But how do you restrict those? What is the rationale for this? What is the proof? And I think there has to be a basis of proof. Otherwise, it goes into a space where it becomes very authoritarian. Even in a democratic country, it becomes authoritarian. And so I think there is a certain risk of that. And when I talk about research, I think there is a lack of research, especially in the mobile phone space. So one of the research that was conducted, like I think in 2021 September, was by the government of Lithuania on Chinese phones, right? And it was a pretty interesting research in terms of what kind of data, and they looked at like censorship models, key list that was part of it. So that actually shows and gives a rationale for how things can move forward, right? And another research that was published, I think in February, like this year, was by a number of researchers in the UK, like students. They looked at like data data in transit, looking at app data, like the bundle apps that come with Chinese apps, right? And what kind of data are they taking, and where are the data going? Does it comply with certain laws in different countries, right? And at Tibet Action, we've just been recently looking at a very basic level at like some of the Chinese, and not even the Chinese like phones which are available like globally, but like Chinese phones which are in Tibet. And we've been looking at those phones and trying to figure out like what are the some of the bundle apps, what are some of the like different permissions. So I think there has to be a better understanding of that, so that that can educate the users on the ground to actually better protect themselves. Because I think the reality is, if you think about like outside, maybe there's a way that like other countries might come up with better phones, whether it's India or like other countries where there might be where there's more freedom to come up with phones which have a similar price point. However, if you think about Tibetans inside Tibet or like Uyghurs, well, you are going to be using Chinese made Android phones, and that is going to be the reality. So the reality is that is like, what is the threat model? How do you better protect yourself? Looking at the situation on the ground, and whether it's like, how do you protect yourself from using some of these apps? Is there a way to sideload secure apps? And if there's a way to sideload secure apps, is the app secure? Because we also need to understand secure app resiliency, like whether is it resilient to the Chinese OS. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be conducted in that space, so that better users can be better educated, and allows people to actually think about ways, right? And I think, Sarah, as you mentioned earlier about like using some of the airdrop, there are things that users sometimes find on their own. As long as they have the information, they can find ways to combat a lot of the censorship and surveillance, but they need the information to understand how they can do that, right? So I think that's an important part of it. As I said earlier, I think there needs to be a comprehensive research in terms of understanding a lot of these tools and phones. And at the same time, I think there needs to be a more comprehensive strategy, especially among Western governments, about Chinese technology that's being used globally.
Thank you, Lobsangla. Your insights into whatever you spoke about how the technologies, the Chinese-made technologies, can be harmful, demonstrate the need for education and support for navigating the digital landscape. Thank you so much for talking about this. And now moving on to the third round of individual question. So Sarah, as We all know that China over the recent years have aggressively stepped up its multilateral tech-related diplomacy. How is China using its influence in international organizations like the UN Human Rights Council and the International Telecommunications Union to promote its model of digital authoritarianism worldwide? And how does its Digital Silk Road initiative under the Belt and Road Initiative play a role in exporting this model of digital authoritarianism across the globe? Over to you, Sarah.
That's a big question. Well, one, I think when we're talking about these global elements, it's so important to still really start at the domestic, in the sense that what is motivating the Chinese Communist Party? And honestly, so much of what it does, both domestically and globally, is to make the world safe for the CCP. And so even when it's now what happens globally, especially when you're talking about, for example, a standard setting body like the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, is that the Chinese government is and its representatives are trying to implement, changes in standard setting that would have global implications, but that ultimately it's because they want to be able to either justify the controls and get better international acknowledgement of the controls they have domestically, or open up more markets and economic opportunities for some of the national champion type companies like Alibaba or Huawei that have been running into problems. And I think at the UN in particular, one of the things the Chinese government has just been really good at doing is getting people who are Chinese diplomats, essentially, appointed to powerful positions. And for a good number of years, the Secretary General of the ITU was actually a Chinese diplomat. And that becomes a very important avenue now to vote for standard setting. You still need more votes, but it becomes a very important way of setting the agenda. And of also, the Chinese government's very good at changing kind of procedural elements, or trying to change them, to basically make the UN and multilateral institutions as state-oriented as possible and squeeze out civil society or non-governmental expertise. And that's, again, one of the things that Chinese diplomats, in certain positions of influence in the system are able to do. And so actually in 2019 and 2020, Huawei introduced an attempt to change IP addresses, which are kind of so fundamental to the operation of the internet. In the end, ITU members actually voted that down. So that's, again, on the flip side, an example of the resilience of the system. I think then you see another pushback, which is that the United States actually put forward a candidate for that position and was able to win that election in September 2022. So I think that actually is very interesting in terms of some of the broader dynamic we've been talking about today, of certain inroads that the Chinese government's able to make in particular directions internationally. But then as you're seeing democratic governments push back more, them running into problems and, again, enhancing the resilience and trying to really push the Chinese government to play by the actual international rules and maybe more democratic rules, a rule-based order that democracies and again, not just Western ones support. And I think when you look at the Digital Silk Road and the BRI initiative generally, this is a massive operation. In a lot of ways, it's an attempt to coordinate and expand things that Chinese companies and the Chinese government were already doing. But again, one of the things we've been starting to see more and more, especially in places like Africa, is civil society, in some cases governments, starting and investigations, like what Lobsang was saying, starting to reveal problems and issues in terms of some of these technologies, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, because there are real benefits. There are more people in Africa who have access to these technologies than they did before, because the Chinese technologies are more affordable, because we're talking about also digital television. There are companies that are able to operate better in rural areas with low bandwidth than maybe their Western competitors. So there is real innovation and competition. It's just that it's a package. And so you end up with more infractions, cyber espionage at the African Union headquarters. Just now there was revelations of a Chinese-based hack against the Kenyan government and Kenyan ministries. And so I think, again, you start to see greater wariness of some of this and a little bit more skepticism, even in the global South, not only in the global North. And so again, I think you get both. There is a real competition here, and I think it really is up to governments and civil society and researchers and investigators, like Lobsang said, to do more, to home in on this and to push back. And in this space, more than others, we've seen that when there is very good documentation, that shows that some of the suspicions that that people have, or concerns and risks that have been raised, are actually happening, that ends up having a real snowball effect and giving information and motivation to enhance resilience. So that's one reason also why those types of investigations are becoming more and more important as well.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And moving on to Rafael. Rafael, as the principal and CEO of SecDev Group and 0 Point Security, you are at the forefront of tackling cyber risk. How are your companies addressing the challenges posed by the rise of China's digital authoritarianism? Could you share some strategies or initiatives that you've implemented to counteract these threats? Rafael?
Yeah, well, maybe I can give you an answer again on two levels. First of all, the first one maybe is more generic and not just against China, but you have to recognize that if you're connected to the internet, you're now at risk. And you're at much greater risk now than you were at any other time, because the number of actors that see you as a resource to be exploited is really significant. And that includes everything from intelligence actors at the sort of one end of the spectrum to smash and grab cyber criminals on the other one. So the watchword here really is resilience. You need to become resilient in the way that you operate within this environment. And I'll give you three ideas. They're not actually mine. They came from Chris Inglis, who is the first director for cyber in the White House, just recently retired, but they come down to this. First of all, build defensible systems. In other words, if you're going to be using the internet for whatever reason, make sure that you're building something that you can actually defend. And that means applying sort of common sense best rules in terms of cybersecurity. Patch your system, have a legally licensed operating system, use multi-factor authentication, back up. It's really simple, but it ultimately at the end of the game gives you 97% assurance that if something is bad happens to you, you're going to be able to recover from it. Secondly, you actually have to defend the system, and that means invest into it. You're not going to buy a car without an airbag or a seatbelt. Why would you be operating your systems without the possibility that you can be breached? A safety belt exists in your car because you're assuming that you're going to get into an accident. So do the same when you're operating your computer systems. And thirdly, prepare for disaster. In other words, recognize that at some stage in the game, something bad can happen. So practice what you would do to make sure that it doesn't happen. So these are generic things. But now let me talk about what we do in terms of specifically China and the export of digital authoritarianism. I think the reality here is this: if you want to change the world, you have to change yourself first. And norms matter. If we believe in certain principles, such as that technologies should not be inimical to personal rights, then we need to actually recognize that those norms are embedded into the technology that we buy. So don't buy technology that is privacy invasive. Don't use it just because it seems to solve some kind of problem that you have. Think creatively in terms of how you could preserve these values without necessarily undercutting them by use of technologies that may actually have these privacy diminishing aspects built into it. Part of the problem that we have, and I think this sort of speaks to foreign assistance as much as foreign policy, is the difficulty in understanding what problem we're trying to solve. And for the United States and most Western countries, for the last 15 years, a lot of what we had as a vision of export of technology was how to counter the threat of terrorism and actors that were going to subvert state authority. That's not a vision of progress. That's not a vision of how do we make society better. Security is not the best way of being able to sell your vision of why your particular political model should be better and more inclusive for others. And I think that's something that we have to recognize, that we have been complicit in creating an environment where digital authoritarianism and their associated technologies somehow have become the norm, rather than looking at technologies that actually enhance individual freedoms, create economic opportunities in others. And I'm not saying that all of us have to wear tie-dye t-shirts, hold hands, sing kumbaya, and say technology is going to make a better world. But I think a little bit more of that is really important if we want to counter the opposite, which is the normalization of security, the securitization of the internet, which is really the virus that allows the spread of digital authoritarianism through norms. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rafael, for this really informative insights and the precautions that you just mentioned. That is really useful for all of us and something that all of us should implement. And moving on to Lufsangla, and our last question is, how can the various communities advocating for freedom and rights from the Chinese government, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Hong Kongers, Mongolians, and the Chinese democracy community work together in countering the CCP's digital authoritarianism and its promotion of a competing digital authoritarian model? Lufsangla.
Thank you, Sakina. I think in some ways, I think this is something that's already happening. And I think maybe it's something that we can thank Xi Jinping for it in some ways, because I think in the last few years, because of a lot of the repression, I think a lot of the different communities, as you mentioned earlier, like Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, like Chinese democracy activists, Taiwanese, a lot of the, like communities that are directly impacted by China are coming together and are working together in terms of whether, if you look at, like, for example, earlier when we were talking about Thermo Fisher, a lot of those campaigns contained a lot of the impacted communities. It just wasn't like Tibetans or Uyghurs alone. And when you look at like the persecution of minorities, like in the sense like the imprisonment and the internment camps in East Turkestan, every other community got together to support the Uyghurs in terms of what was happening. And if you look at like inside Tibet right now with the colonial boarding schools, where there's almost 1 million Tibetan children that is being kind of like cynicized, there's a lot of the communities are getting together. So I think that is something that is happening at the moment, and I think it needs to carry on more. At the same time, I think recognizing that like we are not the only groups that are impacted by China. And I think Sarah mentioned earlier in terms of like the BRCs and all the different groups in terms of like the civil society in a lot of different countries, which are being impacted by a lot of these digital authoritarianism and like the expansion or the export of these tools, which actually hinder a lot of civil society and democracy in a lot of other countries. So I think there is more space for a more global collaboration in terms of, and maybe it's as Raphael said, like about setting up norms that allow us to actually think about what is a more healthy democracy. It's not just about like combating China. It's about like having a more democratic system and using of digital tools to move forward, right? And I think there is a space for that. I think it's at the end of the day, I think it's about collaboration, and at a certain other time, I think it's also about how do you raise the cost for China. And I think we really need to understand how do you raise the cost, like, because I think whether you're thinking about at some of the UN level, if China really needs to invest more in terms of being able to put people that they want in places, right? How do you raise that cost? If like they want to export more tools, how do you raise the cost? So if you are able to raise the cost, that actually reduces a lot of the impact. So I think it's all about raising the cost for China to actually export a lot of that. And I think it's more about a global collaboration in terms of figuring out what is a more democratic system, how can digital be used for a more democratic system. For, I think maybe Rafael, I don't want to say kumbaya, I guess in some ways. So maybe in some ways, I think that's a bit more like trying to be in a more idealized system where we can actually work together, I think.
Thank you so much, Lufsangla, and thank you to all our speakers for being a part of today's discussion and providing a comprehensive overview of China's digital authoritarianism. Your analysis was extremely informative and has highlighted the urgent need for concerted efforts to address this issue. Your expertise in this area has greatly contributed to our understanding of China's digital authoritarianism. I would also like to thank our lovely viewers and to everyone involved for today's discussion. And before I end, let me quickly tell you that the video of the session will be uploaded at Asia Freedom Institute's website at www.asiafreedominstitute.org. And please follow Asia Freedom Institute's Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages for more information on AFI's programs and activities. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. It was a